In the crucible of war, where the line between savior and soldier blurs, there exists a brutal paradox. On the bloody battlefields of World War II, the American medic was a figure of almost supernatural reverence, a guardian angel armed not with a rifle, but with a syringe and a prayer. He was trained to heal, sworn to preserve life, and bound by the sacred oath of the Geneva Convention. Yet, when the fierce fighting of 1944 and 1945 swept through the heart of Europe, American medics advancing with Patton's Third Army and the airborne divisions of the 101st encountered a sight that defied their tactical understanding and shattered their psychological expectations. They were supposed to find a defeated, broken enemy. Instead, they found a German field hospital system that, even as the Third Reich crumbled, operated with an eerie, terrifying efficiency. It was a military machine that, despite being starved of supplies and relentlessly bombed, maintained a level of surgical precision and logistical rigidity that seemed impossible. But what truly unsettled the American combat medic, what made them refuse to believe their own eyes, was not just the clinical sterility of these German aid stations. It was the horrifying realization of the standards of care they represented compared to their own frontline capabilities. It was the quiet, unnerving acceptance by German medics of the inevitable annihilation of their own army. American medics would walk into these captured field hospitals, expecting to see the chaos of a defeated army, only to find patients with surgical incisions so clean they looked like textbook diagrams, operating theaters organized to a fault, and stockpiles of equipment so specific it bordered on the obsessive. This is the story of a collision of two medical worlds in the death throes of the Nazi regime, a story where the American medic, the frontline savior of the infantry, looked at his enemy's field hospital and faced a crisis of confidence. It is a narrative not of heroes and villains, but of tactical dissonance, operational psychology, and the disturbing legacy of German military efficiency that persisted even in the face of total collapse. Why did American medics refuse to believe the existence of these pristine sanctuaries of surgery in the middle of a hellish war? The answer lies deep within the tactical blueprints of the Wehrmacht, the raw, brutal reality of the American frontline experience, and the psychological armor that American medics were forced to build to survive the horrors they witnessed daily. We must strip away the romanticized view of the medics and examine the cold, hard facts of a war of attrition where the ultimate currency was not bullets, but blood. To understand the shock that awaited American medics in the German field hospitals, one must first understand the fundamentally different philosophies that shaped the medical services of the U.S. Army and the German Wehrmacht. It was a clash of industrial titans, separated by a vast ocean and a world of tactical doctrine. The American approach to battlefield medicine was predicated on mass production and industrial logistics. The U.S. Army Medical Corps believed in the evacuation chain. The concept was relatively simple: get the wounded soldier off the front line and back to a safe, highly equipped general hospital as quickly as possible. The emphasis was on mobility and rapid triage. On the front lines, you had the platoon medic, an infantryman with a medical kit, whose primary job was to stop the bleeding, administer morphine, and call for stretcher bearers. The goal was never to perform complex surgery in the field. This system relied heavily on the sheer industrial might of the United States. The Americans built massive, mobile hospital units like the 45th Evacuation Hospital, which could be set up in a field and scaled up to handle thousands of patients. The doctrine was to save lives by moving them away from danger. This was a pragmatic, democratic approach to medicine, treating the soldier as a valuable asset to be preserved and returned to the fight. American medics were trained, often inadequately, in basic trauma care. They were expected to be the first link in a life chain, not the entire chain itself. However, German battlefield medical doctrine, forged in the crucible of World War I and refined in the Blitzkrieg campaigns, was radically different. It was a doctrine born of a scarcity of resources and a belief in the tactical superiority of the offensive. The Wehrmacht Medical Service recognized that if they evacuated every casualty all the way back to Germany, they would lose the manpower and momentum necessary for a swift victory. Thus, the Germans pushed surgery as far forward as possible. They created highly mobile surgical units that could operate within a few kilometers of the front, often under fire. General George S. Patton's medics would later observe this firsthand. While American doctors were often performing damage control to stabilize a patient for evacuation, German surgeons were performing definitive, textbook-perfect resections and repairs in the field. This commitment to forward surgery was not just a logistical necessity, it was a strategic imperative tied to the Wehrmacht's offensive spirit. The German philosophy was cold, precise, and ruthless. The medical structure itself was a mirror of their military structure: strict hierarchy, meticulous planning, and an almost fanatical adherence to protocol. When an American medic walked into a captured German hospital, he was walking into a time capsule of pre-war German industrial efficiency. One of the most disturbing tactical aspects of the German medical system was its deep integration with the partisan and political apparatus of the Third Reich. Field hospitals were often staffed not just by doctors, but by DRK, German Red Cross, personnel who were heavily influenced by Nazi ideology. Later intelligence reports would reveal that some German medical personnel prioritized treating the Aryan, wounded over foreign volunteers or Eastern European laborers, even when the latter were in worse condition. This was a violation of the Hippocratic Oath, turned into state policy. American medics, many of whom were simple men from farms and small towns, struggled to reconcile the clinical perfection of the surgery with the horrifying ideology they knew backed it. Furthermore, the Wehrmacht was not immune to the psychological warfare of medicine. They understood the propaganda value of a well-run field hospital. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, they encountered hospitals that were deliberately left pristine to show the advancing Americans the civilized nature of the German army and to potentially elicit better treatment for captured German soldiers. It was a calculated gamble. The American medics, hardened by months of brutal combat against an enemy they had grown to despise, arrived in these sanctuaries of order and felt an immediate, visceral psychological dissonance. It didn't look like a defeated nation. The American system was a product of democracy, messy, adaptable, and life-saving on a massive scale, but often chaotic. The German system was a product of authoritarianism, rigid, terrifyingly efficient, and capable of performing miracles of surgery in the dirt, but ultimately bound to a suicidal strategy. This clash of medical doctrines would create a lethal misunderstanding. When American medics refused to believe the evidence of their own eyes, they were not just refusing to acknowledge the enemy's humanity. They were refusing to accept the terrifying possibility that their enemy, even while losing the war, had managed to build a superior tactical system for saving lives on the battlefield. The shock of encountering the German field hospital system hit the American combat medic with full force during the brutal hedgerow fighting in Normandy and the subsequent dash across France. But it was in the winter of 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge and the advance into the Siegfried Line, that the psychological impact of these discoveries reached its zenith. Imagine the scene. A frontline medic, let's call him a young tech sergeant with the XII Corps, has been surviving on K-rations and adrenaline for weeks. He has seen friends die from wounds he couldn't reach in time. He has patched up limbs with sulfa powder under machine gun fire. He is emotionally numb, his nerves shot, his perception of reality warped by the constant proximity to violent death. His concept of a medical facility is a muddy tent with a few cots, a bottle of plasma, and a surgeon working by flashlight. Then his unit overruns a German division's aid station in a small town like Niederstall or Berstein. They kick down the door, expecting to find a cellar full of screaming, wounded men and frantic, terrified doctors. Instead, they find silence. They find order. They find a brightly lit, clean operating room where a German surgeon in a pristine white coat is calmly finishing a delicate abdominal surgery. The patient, a young German soldier, is hooked up to a plasma drip that looks cleaner and more sophisticated than anything the Americans have. The American medic is stunned. He looks at the German doctor's hands, steady, methodical, gloved. He looks at the instruments laid out on a sterilized cloth in perfect order. He looks at the charts, meticulously kept, with clear diagrams and legible handwriting. It is a scene ripped from a pre-war medical textbook, not a combat zone. This was the experience of men like Technical Sergeant Albert Del Grigo, who would posthumously receive the Silver Star for his bravery delivering blood to such field hospitals, fully aware that his own aid stations could not compare to the captured German facilities. The realization that the enemy had better medical equipment, more advanced splints, more efficient diagnostic tools, and better surgical lighting was a profound psychological blow. American medics often relied on ingenuity and improvisation. They had on-the-job training that involved learning by doing, often with fatal results. German medics, even in the final year of the war, maintained a level of technical knowledge and specialized training that rivaled civilian specialists. They had been preparing for this war for a decade. The Americans were learning on the fly. This disparity was particularly evident in the treatment of German prisoners. American policy, under the Geneva Convention, mandated that prisoners receive the same standard of care as American soldiers. Yet, many American medics recounted feeling a deep sense of injustice when they saw captured German personnel being treated in a clean, well-equipped facility, while their own men were dying in muddy tents waiting for evacuation. Nurses like Muriel Engelmann, who served in the 128th Evacuation Hospital, treated German prisoners even as they were terrified of being captured themselves. She did her duty, but the psychological resentment was palpable. The operational reality of the German system was built on a cold, brutal calculus. They knew that the only way to win the war in the East and maintain morale in the West was to show their soldiers they would be taken care of. The German soldier fought so tenaciously in part because he knew his medical system was the best in the world. He was willing to take greater risks because he believed in the life chain behind him. When the Americans began to sever that life chain by capturing these hospitals, the psychological impact on the German soldier was immense. It broke their spirit almost as effectively as an artillery barrage. The logistical marvel of the German field hospital was a nightmare for Allied intelligence. They couldn't destroy the hospitals as targets because of the Red Cross protections, yet they knew these facilities were vital to the enemy's combat effectiveness. This led to a cat-and-mouse game. Allied aircraft would often strafe roads near hospitals, making it difficult to move supplies or patients. The Germans responded by moving hospitals into churches and basements, blending into the civilian infrastructure. American medics, many of whom were non-combatants protected by the Geneva Convention, found themselves in a moral quandary. They often had to choose between following orders to advance and stopping to help a wounded soldier. The Germans, on the other hand, seemed to have a more pragmatic view. Treat the wounded that come to you, but do not sacrifice the unit's mobility for one man. There are documented accounts of German medics choosing to evacuate themselves rather than tend to wounded American prisoners, a violation of protocol that enraged their American counterparts. The refusal to believe was not born of ignorance. It was born of trauma. The American medic had to convince himself that the enemy was a subhuman monster to justify the killing and the hardship, to admit that the enemy surgeon was better trained, that his equipment was superior, and his operating theater cleaner, was to admit that the war itself might be a futile, meaningless exercise in slaughter. It was a threat to the very narrative that kept the American soldier fighting. The turning point in the relationship between American medics and the German medical system came not on the battlefield, but behind it. It was the widespread discovery of the concentration camps and the horrifying revelation that the very same German doctors who performed miracles of surgery in the field were complicit in the atrocities of the Holocaust. This shattered the last remnants of the American medics' faith. Prior to 1945, American medics might have admired the German system's efficiency. They saw it as an enemy to be beaten, but they respected its capabilities. However, the advance into Germany revealed a schizophrenic duality. The same nation that produced the renowned field hospitals also produced the death camps. When American forces liberated Dachau and Buchenwald, the medical personnel were often among the first to enter. Army surgeon Paul A. Kennedy, who meticulously documented his cases, entered Dachau just 2 days after its liberation. The site of the camp's medical experiments, the hypothermia tests, the sterilization procedures, the starvation experiments, permanently altered his and his fellow medics' perceptions. They had just come from treating German soldiers in clean hospitals. Now, they were seeing the results of German medical science turned against civilians. The connection was undeniable. The doctor who treated the soldier was the same kind of man as the doctor who experimented on the prisoner. This was the final, terrible proof of the ideological rot at the heart of the system they had just been studying. This realization turned clinical appreciation into visceral disgust. American medics who had once felt inadequate now felt morally superior. They looked at the captured German personnel not as fellow professionals, but as willing participants in a genocidal regime. This was a crucial turning point for American morale. It justified the war in the eyes of the medic. The reason they refused to believe in the goodness of the German system was not because it was inefficient, but because it was morally bankrupt. Efficiency without morality is just terror. The psychological warfare aspect was just as potent. The Germans understood that if they could demoralize the American medics, they could break the American will to fight. By presenting a facade of civilization and order, they were attempting to sow doubt. If we are so civilized, the German logic went, why are you fighting us so hard? This tactic was particularly effective in the bitter winter battles. Consider the case of the 45th Evacuation Hospital, which treated and later exchanged German nurses captured after the fall of Cherbourg. The American hospital staff were ordered to give the German nurses a tour of the American facilities, feeding them and showing them how well German POWs were being treated. The Americans hoped the nurses would remember and treat their people with the same kindness. This was a calculated move by American intelligence to use the medical system as a tool of psychological warfare to create goodwill and encourage German medical personnel to surrender. The American medics, however, harbored deep suspicions. They wondered if these nurses were spies or party loyalists. They resented the resources being spent on the enemy. This was especially difficult for nurses like Muriel Engelmann, who was Jewish and had an H for Hebrew on her dog tags. She was terrified of being captured, yet she was forced to treat the very people who would have sent her to a camp. The incident where 2 American 101st Airborne medics, Robert Wright and Kenneth Moore, treated both American and German soldiers in the church of Angoville-Plain is a microcosm of this psychological conflict. They treated everyone equally because it was their duty. However, decades later, Moore reflected on the moment, nodding that the Germans were young men much like us, except they were wearing a different uniform. This humanization of the enemy was a form of psychological surrender, but it was only possible because of a shared humanity within the narrow confines of medical care. But for most American medics, the turning point came when they realized the Germans were fighting for a lost cause. The field hospitals, no matter how pristine, were retreating. They were running out of supplies, running out of blood, and running out of doctors. The Americans were not just winning a military battle, they were winning a logistical war. The German medics, bound by their Prussian code of honor, often chose to stay with their patients rather than retreat, leading to their capture. The psychological shock for the American medic was not the discovery of the German hospital's superiority, but the eventual realization of its impotence. The machine was running perfectly, but it was running in place. The war had moved on. The American medic who had once felt inferior now felt pity. The refusal to believe was replaced by a grim, quiet confidence. The impact of confronting the German field hospital system was not just a historical or psychological curiosity. It had a direct and tangible effect on American tactical doctrine and technological development in the post-war era. The American medical establishment, initially shocked by the German efficiency, quickly began a process of analysis and adaptation. The lessons learned reports from the European theater highlighted the German emphasis on forward surgery. This directly contributed to the development of the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, or MASH, concept, which would become iconic in the Korean War. The Americans realized that despite their massive logistical tail, they needed to push surgical capability further forward to save lives. The German experience forced a philosophical shift. Furthermore, the technological disparity was undeniable. German surgical lighting, autoclaves, and portable X-ray machines were superior to much of the American equipment. The American military-industrial complex, which had focused on mass production of basic supplies, had to pivot. The discoveries in German hospitals led to the adoption of new standards for medical equipment in the U.S. Army. The capture of German medical supply depots often provided American doctors with a view of the future of battlefield medicine, a future they had not anticipated. Strategically, the battle for medical superiority became a proxy war. The Allies used the threat of bombing medical facilities to try to force German surrender, while the Germans used their hospitals as bargaining chips. In 1944, a notable exchange of German nurses took place near Balleroy, France, negotiated by a ceasefire. The American command recognized the propaganda value of treating the captured nurses well. This was high-stakes psychological warfare. If the Americans treated the German medics poorly, it would stiffen German resistance. If they treated them well, it might encourage others to surrender. The American medics, however, often felt they were being used as pawns. The strategic impact was also felt on the home front. The heroic stories of medics like Ken Moore and Bob Wright were used to sell war bonds. The narrative of the selfless medic treating friend and foe alike was a powerful piece of propaganda that softened the harsh realities of war. It presented a vision of American exceptionalism and morality that contrasted sharply with the Nazi ideology. The technological and strategic impact of this clash of medical systems is still felt today. The modern U.S. military's emphasis on prolonged field care, advanced trauma kits, and forward surgical teams is a direct descendant of the analysis conducted in the aftermath of World War II. The American medic who walked into that German hospital and felt a crisis of confidence was actually witnessing the future. He was seeing the evolutionary endpoint of a medical system built for total war. The U.S. Army, despite the initial psychological shock, learned the lesson of the German field hospital and turned it into a strength. The story of why American medics refused to believe the evidence of the German field hospital is ultimately a story about the human condition in extremis. It is a tale of cognitive dissonance, of the mind's desperate attempt to preserve its sanity in a universe of chaos. The American medic was a product of his environment, a democratic society that viewed war as a necessary evil to be ended as quickly as possible. The German medic was a product of his, a totalitarian state that viewed war as a permanent condition of existence. When these two worlds collided over a stretcher, the American saw a machine he could not understand, and the German saw a man he could not respect. The refusal to believe was a shield. It protected the American medic from the horrifying realization that his enemy was just as competent, just as dedicated, and just as human as he was. To accept the German doctor's skill was to accept the death of the myth of Nazi incompetence. It was to accept that war was not a battle of good versus evil, but a battle of efficient systems versus inefficient ones. It was to accept that the line between savior and killer was thinner than they had ever imagined. But history shows that the American refusal was temporary. The shock faded, the analysis began, and ultimately the democratic system proved more adaptable. The American medic, flawed and undertrained, could not match the Prussian efficiency of his counterpart, but he could learn, and he did. The final act of the war in Europe saw these two medical systems fuse briefly. In the prisoner of war camps, German doctors were forced to work alongside American medics. The camps became a strange battlefield of medical diplomacy. So consider the legacy of the German field hospital. It was the ghost at the feast of the American victory. It was a reminder that technological perfection is no match for moral clarity, and that even in the midst of a righteous war, the enemy is never a monster. The question left hanging in the air, as the last German surgeon laid down his scalpel in 1945, is not whether the Americans were right to refuse to believe, but whether the Germans were wrong to think they could win a war with surgery. The American medic walked out of Germany carrying a scar deeper than any bullet wound. It was the scar of a shattered illusion, the illusion that they were the only civilized men in a world gone mad. They had seen the enemy's operating theaters, and they knew, deep down, that the war they fought was not against a barbarian horde. It was against a competing vision of civilization. And in that terrifying realization, they found the strength to win.